All right, what's going on, guys? I figured I'd upload a real quick tutorial here to kind of show you how to bake texture maps from a high poly model to a low poly model. And basically, you just want to keep in mind that your low poly is going to have to be very close to the shape and size of your high poly model, number one. Number two, you want to make sure that your low poly has already been unwrapped. Um, and you also want to make sure that you understand what retopologizing is, or retopology. So basically, if you make a high poly model of anything and it's really intricate, you're going to have to make a low poly that fits very closely to the high poly in shape and size. So you'll have to probably recreate step by step your own low poly model that you may not be able to make out of just simple primitives. And basically right here, I was able to do that because it's not too intricate, but I did have to make this in a way where the edges were a little bit more smoothed off because I wanted to capture the details here. And when it's projecting, like say a normal map, if this was just a straight corner, it wouldn't look right. So you kind of just want to make sure that your low poly, to the best of its ability, without using up too much polygon and texture memory, fits what would be suitable for the projection itself. So as you can see here, pretty high poly model. This would not be okay to be putting into a game. So you just want to capture the detail of this and project it onto this, be it a normal map, height map, ambient occlusion map, specular map, things like that. So basically what you do, number one, you want to make sure both of these are occupying the same space. Like so. And then what you also want to make sure is that the low poly has a clear material on it that hasn't been used for anything. So if you have to make a new one, go for it. This way you'll be able to see what the final result in the bake is going to look like in 3ds Max or Maya before you bring it into a game engine. So I've already pretty much done this, but let me show you real quick the process of how you're going to pull this off. So here we got the low poly. Again, you want to make sure you've already unwrapped this. So we'll just assume you've done that. Go down to projection. And what you want to make sure right off the bat is that you select the high poly. Now, the blue thing that you're seeing around both models there is called the cage. I want to make sure that's clicked on shaded. You want to make sure that this cage is engulfing both models. Has a little bit of space in between the cage and the models, but you want to keep it as close as possible to both models. There you go. That's pretty good. And if you have any errors or anything like that in your bake, it's probably going to come up in red. That's usually the default. And if that's the case, what you just need to do is click on this and you'll see a bunch of vertices. You can move these around. So if this was a more intricate model, let's say that you were making a projection of a rock and you did a lot of detail in Mudbox or ZBrush and you did a retopology low poly model where you did it by hand, and you're just trying to make sure that this cage is completely engulfing the entire rock, but again, being very close to both models, you'll be able to better shape it using the vertices. So now once that's done, you want to go up here to render setup. You want to make sure that under render, you could use Hammersley if you want. I use this usually. Make sure that's selected. Pretty much all the other defaults here. Oh yeah, you want to make sure it's not on light tracer too, because that's usually for ambient occlusion bakes. So just change those two. And then what you would do next is go under render to texture. Down here, you want to make sure that this is selected. By default, that's what it's going to look like, and it's going to say no projection modifier. So select that and make sure both of these are on 1, and that's exactly why you're going to unwrap your low poly model. That should already pop up that way. We'll just delete that. And you go to Normals Map. And you can select whatever resolution you want. Now it's going to put it in the target map slot, so it's probably going to do it into the material already. But if you want to see it pop up instantly, and this is usually after you've been able to select your viewport to display these different texture maps, you can do it to that too if you want. Just come down here and hit render, and what's going to happen is going to render it out. And again, if there's any errors, you'll see it in red as it does it. It'll pop up in a little dialog window. I'd do it right now, but it's going to take forever for me to do that. So this is basically the final version of the material. As you can see down here, bump is selected. I put it up to 120 so you can see a little bit more detail when it actually gets put on the cube here. As you can see, these corners are pretty much engulfed by the low poly, and they curve very closely to the high poly. That's why you're not seeing any seams or any weird artifacts on the final render. But if you're curious as how do I set this up, just take a normal material down here under maps, right? So again, we'll just do 120. Select that, and you want to go under normal bump, not bitmap. Now you're going to select the bitmap. And we select the one that we already did. That's done. Now when you do that, this may happen, but this is what you have to do. Okay, then it's going to show your normal map with the original material instead of it being all blue. So if you didn't select the normal map first and then bitmap, you would have just gotten the blue one on there, and that's not what you want. You're not going to be able to actually see it that well when you do changes to the intensity of the normal map and things like that. So that's basically how that works with the normal map projection. And the only thing that you're going to change differently when you're rendering a height map is going to be the texture type. Everything else is basically the same. So then you'd come down here, delete that, just go to height map. Again, select the resolution. It's going to go into displacement. I would probably pick diffuse to take a look at it, but it may be too subtle for you to notice it. So I would say the best way to actually know that this height map worked is to go actually look at the final bake. And if I were to do that right now, close this, it's not going to be that easy to see it unless we zoom in, but you'll be able to see that, like in the corners, for instance, a little bit in the middle, you can clearly see that it's picked up some height map information. It's not too intense, so it's not going to be very high detailed, but it did work. Now the AO projection that I did, this is actually going to show up. Now it has shadows in areas that I probably don't want. There's ways to fix this. I will put in the description when I figure that out so that everybody can actually do that. Right now I think that since I haven't done this in a while, this may just be the way that the light is projecting everything. Now if you use a skylight, I noticed that it will just make everything all white. It could just be the intensity of the skylight is too high. But since this is going to be projecting within a cage, there's already light coming in from the cage. Basically, the light comes out of your model, bounces off the cage, and then bounces back in. And what's happening is that the light rays are coming off the high poly, bouncing off the cage, and then burning it onto the low poly model. But there is a way to kind of fix these kind of shadows burned in. Once you get rid of those, this is basically, it's like a normal map, but it's just going to be on a whiter material. And that's another thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the material that you're going to be baking your ambient occlusion on is white. Now, if for any reason you have issues in 3ds Max or Maya trying to create one of these, you could use a program like Crazy Bump, take your normal map that you projected, and then just use that to create the other texture maps. I mean, it's kind of cheating, but it works. Or you can use XNormal, for instance, to bake your maps, if worst comes to worst, but I figured I'd just show you how to do it in 3ds Max here. So what I'm going to show you different about that type of bake with ambient occlusion is that basically there's going to be a few things that are going to matter, and if you don't have these set up right, it's not going to work. So this time around, instead of using max 2.5 star, I use Hammerslay. I make sure that this is at 1, usually it's 0.5. Then you come down here and select Light Tracer. And under here, I'll usually use, like 300 or 400. And you can mess with the global multiplier as well as the bounces if you want, but just be careful. Know what each one does before you mess with them. So you have that all selected. And then again, it would be going down to render to texture. Again, make sure that projection is enabled. These are all set up properly there. Delete that. And I believe that this would be a shadows map, but if not, you can try a lighting map. I think both of them kind of do the same thing depending on how you have them set up. You could even probably do it with a complete map because that's just going to take the white and then the shadows as well, and create your ambient occlusion. We'll say that basically it's like a shadows map. Set up your resolution, select the name of it, where you're going to put it, and then just click render, and that's pretty much it. Just once that's done, you'll be able to use those texture maps in a game engine or whatever else you're actually using. And they don't really do this for like movie CGI and things like that. Normal maps, maybe some ambient occlusion, but mainly that's just for adding a detail of a CGI movie. But for game assets, it's definitely needed because you're not going to be obviously bringing in a high poly model, as your game would just completely crash. So let me just put a great texture on the original here. But as you can see, they look basically identical. And, it's basically going to trick the player. I mean, those who don't really do this kind of stuff for a living, it'll trick the player into believing that it's a higher detailed model or a higher poly model than it actually is. Again, we'll just go take a look. Now, this is going to be counting right here. You've probably seen this up in the corner. This is counting all the polys in the project. So if I were to like delete this, see how quickly that changes down to less than 1,000? So as you can see, you can get the same results by doing this, and you won't be bringing your computer to its knees. So that's basically it, guys. So hopefully you're able to learn something. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. If you would like to see any more tutorials, feel free to ask. I'm going to try to make a few tutorials that would actually be relevant for game design. I'll probably do some Mudbox tutorials as well to kind of show you how I created this. Some subtle details on the final project, and then bring it into whatever 3D modeling program you're going to use. And I'll probably make a retopologizing workflow for when you make high poly assets, and you need to make a low poly that's going to match it. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's kind of hard. It depends on what you're doing, but once you figure out how to do it, you're basically anything that you create in a sculpting program, you're going to be able to make a low poly version of it, and then just bake the detail, and you'll be all set to go. So, all right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.